All right, let's begin with this. What we're looking at, the Civil Rights Movement. This is the STAR Review number 12. Again, that number doesn't really matter to us. This is the American Republic, chapter 24, or in the Jarrett book, it would be chapter 13. Okay, and so we're looking here. We're seeing several different images. I'm going to highlight a couple of them just to sort of give you an idea. We got Rosa Parks up here in the upper right-hand corner. We have Jackie Robinson right there. Martin Luther King. This would be Linda Brown right there. Another King. Another picture of Martin Luther King. We have Thurgood Marshall right there. Protest. Black and white together. We saw this in the American Republic book. Again, part of the Freedom Rides. The Freedom Riders who were roughed up by the people in the Deep South as they came southward, looking to get African Americans registered to vote. They ran into some of these problems. We have the Little Rock 9 right here. We saw that image, or at least a different angle of that image. And here is a picture of one of the civil rights piece of legislation. I think it's the 64 legislation being signed. And so again, just some different images of some of the things that are going on. And of course, our last one here, oh yeah, Forrest Gump. Yeah, okay. This is the governor of Georgia. I'm sorry, forgive me, not Georgia. Alabama, George Wallace, standing in the door to stop the African Americans from entering school at Alabama. So. All right, let us move forward, and here is our first one. This is one of those kind of reactive ones, and they kind of come in slowly, and that's annoying to me, so I'm going to kind of speed through this. All right, here we have the Civil War amendments. Now, again, this may not be, you need to write everything down. As I think I've told you in the past, when you are taking notes, try to hit the highlights. Take as many notes as you can. But you don't have to write every word. Learn how to abbreviate. Look and see what's important. Okay? And so we're looking at the Civil War amendments, and we're going to focus on the 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendments. And of course, these are really the beginning of civil rights for African Americans here in America. So our first bullet, slavery, of course, was permitted in all areas of our nation when we were still part of England. As we become a nation, there were some changes to that. The North essentially did away with slavery, either the importation of slavery or the outright ownership of slavery over the years. The Constitution called for a ban on the importation of slaves, black slaves from Africa by 1808. So there were some steps. But in the Deep South, and again, the Deep South would be Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, the Carolinas, okay, those Confederate states, they still clung to slavery. But after the Civil War, we had things beginning to change. And there were some constitutional amendments that we're going to look at that brought about change. Our first one in 1865 is the 13th Amendment. This abolished slavery. Slavery is no longer legal anywhere in the United States. Now again, if you're a strict constructionist, you're probably going to go, well, yeah, slavery never was legal. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. One of the most famous lines from the Declaration. Slavery, however, is never mentioned in the Constitution. The word. And so we needed a constitutional amendment to ensure that some, redneck cracker judge in Tupelo, Mississippi, did not infringe upon the rights of a black man after the end of the Civil War. So an amendment was passed, and now slavery is illegal. Okay? The 14th Amendment, 1868. This provided for equal protection under the law and gave those born here citizenship. Now, we do have an issue with this over the years. Prior to 1868, to be a U.S. citizen, you have to be born to American parents. But because of this, we now interpret that differently. Originally, it was only aimed at the African Americans who had been born here, the black slaves who had been born here, and they were retroactively made citizens. But over the course of the last 50 to 60 years, we've had several Supreme Court cases which have sort of redefined that. So now if you're born anywhere on the planet to U.S. parents, you're a U.S. citizen. If you're born anywhere on the planet on U.S. territory, like a naval base, for example, even though it is on Guam or out in the middle of the ocean, if you're born on a U.S. naval ship, since that's U.S. territory, you are considered to be a U.S. citizen. So we have sort of expanded our definition of what becomes, or how do you become a citizen. And probably the most important thing from this, though that is extremely important, is this concept of equal protection under the law. Though not in here is also the process, or due process, okay? And my handwriting is atrocious. There should be another S. There it goes. Due process is also part of the 14th Amendment. Those really today, due process and equal protection, are far more important than the citizenship clause. But again, times change. It originally was aimed at the former black slaves who are now free and retroactively making them U.S. citizens. Our final one of our Civil War, actually this is post-Civil War, our post-Civil War amendments would be number 15 in 1870, gave the former slaves, male slaves, we're still living in a somewhat, male-dominated society in 1870, gave former male slaves suffrage, or the right to vote. Women, former black female slaves, were not allowed to vote. Women were still not allowed to vote at this time, though we will see over the course of the next 30 years, women beginning to vote in certain western territories, western states, mostly due to a lack of population. In 50 years, by 1920, the 19th Amendment gives women universal suffrage. But in 1870, black men can vote, but no women. Now, again, the idea was to provide blacks the right to vote, but we're still not going to give women the right to vote. Because you can't give a black woman the right to vote if you deny white women the right to vote. That's why it was defined as black men only. Okay. Again, these are the foundation, these amendments are the foundation of the civil rights movement here, well, in the 20th century. Of course, we're now in the 21st century. Move to our next one. And we saw a picture of Jackie Robinson just a moment ago. This is the same picture that we saw in the intro. And of course, Jackie Robinson, number 42. By the way, his number's been retired by Major League Baseball. There will never be another Major League Baseball player who wears the number 42. It's been retired for the entire professional sport. Now, you can wear it in high school or college, but not in the pros. There was a movie that came out, 42, a couple of years ago. I don't know if you've seen it or not. Pretty good movie that sort of depicts some of the problems, some of the issues that Jackie Robinson had breaking the color line in Major League Baseball. Okay, so let's take a look at the Truman years. This is from 45 to 53. Truman became president when Franklin Roosevelt died in 1945, shortly after Roosevelt was sworn in for his fourth term. Truman then finishes out that term and then runs for his own term. So he served from 45 to 48, which was Roosevelt's term. Then he got his own term in 48 and left office in 53 when Eisenhower became president. Okay, so during the Truman years, Truman was a Democrat. Okay, again, we're starting to look at the difference between Republicans and Democrats during this era and how they treated the African Americans. So in 47, Jackie Robinson, who was the grandson of a slave, became the first African American to play professional baseball. This is a huge step forward. Were there other baseball players, black players before him who were qualified? Oh, heck yeah. The Negro Leagues, which was a separate professional league, had any number of players who could play with the Major League Baseball teams, and they often did. Oftentimes, there would be these barnstorming tours the all-star team from the Negro Leagues would play an all-star team from Major League Baseball. Arguably one of the greatest pitchers of all time, a man by the name of Satchel Paige, who finally made Major League Baseball, finally got in the majors in his mid to late 40s. No one actually knew his age. Anyway, he struck out 6 of the greatest hitters of all time. Definitely the 6 greatest hitters of that era. And we're talking in the early 30s. Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, and we're talking Hall of Famers. He struck them all out. So, yes, the Negro League baseball players could play, had the talent to play, but they were not allowed to play in the major leagues because it was against the law. So, number 42 opened the door for many African Americans and other minorities. And again, rising tide lifts all boats. Major League Baseball before Jackie Robinson was lily white. No Hispanics, no Cubans, no Mexicans, no blacks. But after he played, we start to see a number of minorities, black, Hispanic, blah, 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 not only in Major League Baseball, but in other areas of sports, football, basketball, others. Of course, entertainment and business. Finally, the following year, and this was, keep in mind again, this was in 1947. So in 1948, President Truman issues an executive order desegregating the military and ending discrimination hiring practices by federal government. Now, that sounds sweet, but to be perfectly honest, it didn't happen. There was an executive order saying, yeah, we're not going to do this, but there was never anything backing it up until Eisenhower becomes president a few years down the road. So Truman did start the ball rolling, but his administration really did little to do anything. Why? Well, again, there's a lot of pitfalls. There's a lot of landmines trying to desegregate schools and restaurants and hotels. Major League Baseball. The Deep South was the home of the Democrat Party. Truman was a Democrat. And it's one thing to say, yeah, okay, we're going to make everybody equal, but to do it, particularly with an election coming up, that's another story altogether. But he did start it. He did get this executive order signed, but it really wasn't fully enforced until the next president. All right. Brown versus the Board of Education, 1954. And Linda Brown, and there is a picture of Linda Brown down here. And again, as I have told you, her name is on the lawsuit, the Supreme Court case, Brown versus the Board of Education, because her name was the first one alphabetically. Okay, so Brown versus the Board of Education, 1954. Civil rights won in large part through litigation in the courts. Much of the segregation that was desegregated, much of the segregation that was ended, was done so through the courts. Now, of course, there was legislation, but then again, legislation is useless unless there is something to back it up. The 18th Amendment is prohibition. We're no longer going to manufacture, sell, or drink alcohol. But without the Volstead Act, which put teeth in it, no one would have obeyed it. No one would have paid attention to it. So a law being passed or a court case being rendered is irrelevant unless there is some way to punish those who break that law. So there was a lot of progress through the legislative process, true, but more so through litigation, through lawsuits like the Brown versus the Board of Education. Now again, Brown says, essentially, we're going to do away with segregation. We'll do away with legalized segregation. But again, unless there's legislation that is being enforced at the federal and local level, that legislation means nothing. Okay, let's continue with this. Our second bullet, most of these cases were decided by the Supreme Court, and here is a look at our court over here in the upper right. Okay. In the 1954 Supreme Court case, again, 1954, we are looking at a few years after Jackie Robinson. has broken the color barrier. By now, there are a number of African Americans in Major League Baseball. The Brown versus the Board of Education decision is rendered, and this was a huge step forward, a huge success for the civil rights movement. Keep in mind, at the end of the Civil War, and again, this is something you should have covered previously, either you covered it in your U.S. history class as an 8th grader, or you may have covered it in your normal class. At the end of the Civil War, southern states, those southern Democratic strongholds, passed legislation requiring segregation of the races in public places like schools. And again, this is the Plessy versus Plessy decision. Plessy versus Ferguson. And let's take a quick look at Plessy versus Ferguson, just to sort of refresh your memory. So here we have in the upper right-hand corner, it may be a little bit difficult to read, but right here, a sign reading whites only. This appears to be some type of railroad car. Blacks were not allowed on it. They had their own railroad cars. Down here in the bottom right, we appear to have what looks like a school for African Americans. Again, Plessy gave us separate but equal. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled in the Plessy versus Ferguson decision that separate but equal was constitutional. Separate railroad cars, separate bathrooms, separate hotels, separate everything. If they're equal, it's legal. Now, of course, they never were equal. But the law was upheld. Now, again, a Supreme Court case is not necessarily law. It's an opinion. But since a huge chunk of the states, particularly in the South, like that decision, they made it law. Let's look at our third bullet real quickly. States could legally provide segregated facilities to different races, and we're only talking really about the whites and the blacks. Okay. Now again, Hispanics, Mexican Americans are not a race, by the way. That's a nationality and ethnic group, but they really were not included in this. We're just looking at blacks and whites. They could be segregated as long as they were equal in quality. Now again, they never were equal. But that is what the decision stated. Although schools were supposed to be equal, most schools in the South were greatly inferior. Most schools in the South for black students were greatly inferior to those schools for white students. The NAACP lawyers, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which started in the early 1900s. It is the oldest advocacy group for African Americans in America. They began to challenge this decision as soon as they could. Quick story, two quick stories actually. My grandparents, who we used to go visit every summer, lived in a city here in the state of Texas called Rockdale. It's about 45 minutes southeast of Austin. If you head up Highway 77 from Harlingen to Raymondville to Kingsville, and you stay on 77, you will run into Rockdale. There's a couple small little German towns on the way, Schulenburg and Hallettsville. If you've never been up Highway 77, you've never seen these places. We used to stop as a child, I was probably 8 to 10, at a little bakery in one of those towns. I forget which one. I'm in the car while my parents go inside to get some donuts, some other stuff. As I'm sitting there, I look around and I see a couple doors down from the bakery, two doors. One door has above it whites only, the other door has blacks only. Asked my parents about it, and they never really answered that I remember. Now, they may have told me everything I need to know, but I just don't remember it. Somewhere within that frame of work, now keep in mind, I was born in 1958, so we're talking 1968, 1970 or so. Somewhere within that time frame, before I was 10, my grandfather died. I was in 4th grade, so I was 10 years old. And Before that period of time, my father, my grandfather, I guess a couple of my siblings were out riding around, and my grandfather made a comment, oh, there's the black school. That was a school in Rockdale where the black students went. Rockdale always has had a very large African American population. Well, the school had just been recently closed, and all those black students who had been going to that school were now being bused to the other side of town because of desegregation laws. And again, this is around 68, 69, 57, 67, 68, somewhere around there. So it's within my lifetime. Now, of course, it's probably not within your parents' lifetime, but again, it's within my lifetime, maybe your parents, that we still had this type of segregation. Any thoughts or questions? Good. Let's move forward. Now, what we're going to take a quick look at are several pictures of separate but equal, and you will see how unequal they are. Now, again, I'm not really going to point out a lot, but I'm just going to sort of mention some things. And again, what are we looking at? We're looking at the concept of separate but equal. Yeah, they were separate, but they were never equal. So here we have a couple of water fountains. I like the little angels there. That's cute. Okay. Here is another separate but equal water fountain. And you can see the colored one for blacks. The fountain for white people was probably cooled. You had cool water. And the other one was just water from the tap. Imperial Laundry Company, we wash for white people only. And this is a sign that was outside of this business. Again, giving you an idea of how Plessy worked. Waiting room for colored only, by order of the police department. So waiting rooms, and I assume this is for a hospital. It could be some other place, I guess, for a government building, but waiting room, again, separate. When I saw this, yeah, I don't know if you can read the sign down here. No white people allowed in the zoo today. As it reads at the bottom, it's a little bit difficult to read, but during this period of time, the zoo was opened up only to black students within this community. The Rex Theater, for colored people only.
Sir, I'm sorry, in the bottom it said that blacks weren't allowed to go into.
Let's continue. Okay, I think we got that one. I think we have a few more of these. Separate is not equal. This looks to be a little bit more of a modern sign, at least it's in color. Okay, so those are just some examples of some of the segregation that you could find throughout, more than likely in the South. Could you find some of that in the North? Yes. Were Northerners more tolerant of blacks? Not really. They had the same prejudices. It's just that it was less acceptable to be racist in the North than it was in the South. So most of those probably were in the South, but again, you could probably find some of that stuff, some of that legal segregation in the North as well. Okay, here's one that affects us in the state of Texas. This is the Sweat versus Painter decision, 1950. And this Supreme Court case, okay, the NAACP was involved on involving the rights of Herman Sweat, who was an African American, who was attempting to attend the law school at the University of Texas. Go fight Windhorns. Hook 'em, baby. Okay. Oh my God, it was 1970, I think, before UT recruited the first black player. The Southwest Conference, which Texas was a part of at that time in the 1960s, was not desegregated. Jerry Levias I believe was the first black man to play football in the Southwest Conference. Anyway, Texas is a part of the Deep South. Texas is a part of the old Confederacy. So, UT even created a separate law school for African Americans just to keep sweat out. Now again, take a moment. They created an entirely separate law school for African Americans, of which there was only one, to keep him out of the classes with the white students. Now again, this is 1950. We are just a few years removed from the Brown decision, yet the government had really not done much of anything to enforce that decision. As I told you, court cases are just opinions. They really carry no weight of law. In order for a Supreme Court opinion to be valid, to be of some value, there needs to be legislation, there needs to be enforcement. And there really had been little, if any, within this period of time. The Supreme Court ruled that the separate school failed to qualify as separate but equal. Why? Because it isolated its students. Now, the court is not ruling that separate but equal is illegal. That doesn't come to 54 with the Brown decision. We're 3 years after Jackie Robinson. But what the court ruled is that this decision was based on the separate but equal not being met. Why? Because sweat was isolated. Therefore, it's not equal.
Sir,
Yes.
were the teachers from the
All right, let's continue. We're looking at the challenge to the separate but equal. Okay, we're challenging the separate but equal. Oh, sorry about that. And change that. There we go. NAACP challenges that. In 1953, the NAACP challenged the Kansas court ruling that African American students were denied admission to an all-white school. So there was a court ruling that said black students cannot enter because this is an all-white school. It was challenged by the NAACP. We talked about them a few moments ago. The NAACP alleged that segregated schools denied African American children the equal protection of the 14th Amendment. As I mentioned to you a little while ago, the most important aspects of the 14th Amendment was not citizenship, it was due process and equal protection under the law. So because of the fact that denying black students to a white school denied them equal protection, denied them equal protection under the law, it should have been overturned. Segregated schools were inherently inferior. They were inferior because they were inferior. Not because the teachers weren't as good, which they weren't usually. Not because the facilities were not as good, which they were not. They were just inferior because it's an inferior concept. Plessy got it wrong. And it was wrong from the day it was passed to the day it was done away with. It is just inherently wrong. You can go even deeper. The message being sent to black students is that you're not as good as white students. You're not good enough to be educated with whites. Again, denying them equal protection and due process, part of the 14th Amendment. All right, the Brown decision. We got a few more slides and we'll be done with this and we'll move on to something else. Okay, so we have the Brown decision. The Brown versus the Board of Education. Here it is down here. of Topeka, Kansas. Keep in mind, the previous slide said there had been a ruling in Kansas. This is overturning that law. It overturned Plessy versus Ferguson from the late 1800s. Now, I think we've already seen this image, but here we have a picture of Linda Brown, the young girl, whose name is at the head of the Brown versus the Board of Education decision. And then you have Thurgood Marshall, who was one of the NAACP lawyers who argued the case before the court, and he eventually becomes the first African American to sit on the Supreme Court. So, back to the case, 1954, Marshall argued the case, and he argued that Linda Brown, who was an African American girl, was forced to go across town to school, even though there was a perfectly good school within a few blocks from where she lived. The problem with that school that was close to her is that it was a school for whites. And the NAACP argued it's not right, it's not fair. We are breaking her constitutional rights as a U.S. citizen by forcing her to go across town to school when there's a perfectly good school nearby. The court agreed. In fact, Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote the unanimous decision for the court, in which Plessy was overturned, and now separate but equal has been deemed unconstitutional. A few more of the things, again, a couple more slides and we will stop. The Montgomery bus boycott, 1955 through 1956. We already took a look at this, a picture of Rosa Parks, who in 55 refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery, Alabama bus to a white passenger, which was the law. Blacks sat in the back of the bus. If there were more white people on the bus than there were seats, then the blacks had to get off the bus. Now, before you think or say, well, she was tired, had nothing to do with it. This was an organized protest. This was done on behalf of the NAACP. It was Alabama's Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow refers to segregation, legalized segregation in the South, that made this illegal. It was illegal for her not to give up her seat to a white passenger. She was required by law to give up her seat to a white passenger if he said to. When she refused, she was arrested, and here she is being booked, fingerprinted right there.
Thank you.
Dr. Martin Luther King, who I believe that this is him right there. A little bit difficult to tell. It's not a very large or very clear picture. But he led a boycott. He led the Montgomery bus boycott for 13 months. Blacks and many, many whites boycotted, did not ride on the buses, the public bus system of Montgomery, Alabama. This nonviolent boycott, King was a believer in the Gandhi school of protest, nonviolence. This nonviolent boycott worked. The court ruled the bus line had violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Again, 14th Amendment, equal protection, due process. Just like Linda Brown had been denied her equal protection under the law, Rosa Parks had been denied her equal protection under the law to ride public transportation. Now, if this was a privately owned bus, could they have denied giving blacks a ride? Yes, it's a privately owned company. It will be decades before we start to attack that. But in a public transportation, it must provide equal protection. If whites get to ride it, so do blacks. And that is what the courts ruled. Civil Rights Act of 1957. This is 10 years after Jackie Robinson. This is 3 years after Brown versus the Board of Education. President Eisenhower, keep in mind Eisenhower is the president. He became president and he was elected in 52. He is a Republican. He was a World War II war hero. He signed the Civil Rights Act in 1957 to increase African American voting in the South. Why were blacks having problems voting? Literacy tests. Poll taxes. This is two ways that the Deep South, the Democrat-controlled South, kept blacks from voting. You had to be able to read. You had to be able to comprehend what you read. That's the literacy test. The poll tax was you had to pay to vote. And since blacks were undereducated, they were less likely to be able to read and comprehend what they read, and they're less likely to be able to pay in order to vote. So while some whites were excluded, the majority of blacks, particularly in the Deep South, were also excluded, which was the idea behind Jim Crow. Jim Crow laws limited the ability of blacks to vote without paying either a poll tax, or are passing a literacy test. Right there. The law also created the Civil Rights Commission, which is still in effect to this day, giving federal courts the power, now this is important. Again, you got some cracker, redneck, Klan lover, judge in Tupelo, Mississippi. He's going to ignore federal law and say, hey, this is the state of Mississippi. We get to make our own laws. That's why we fought the War of the Rebellion, which we call the Civil War. So you needed federal law, you needed federal enforcement. The Civil Rights Commission gave federal power to the courts to register African American voters. All right. Unfortunately, most registration procedures were so complex that the act proved to be relatively ineffective. But it is a step forward. And again, what we're looking at are some of these steps becoming more and more effective. Now, would it have been great if we'd have gone, snap our fingers, all of a sudden all the problems are done away with? Yes. But we're looking at in the Deep South, where slavery had been a way of life from the colonial days, through the Revolution, up to the end of the Civil War. Now, from the end of the Civil War in 65 through 57, 90 plus years later, though there's still no slaves, but these Jim Crow laws, and again, this is important to understand, these Jim Crow laws were laws that were passed in order to keep the blacks in line, to prevent them from voting, prevent them from getting properly educated, blah, blah, blah. So you needed federal power to regulate, to register African American voters. And as I said, even though it was relatively ineffective at this time, it did pave the way for later civil rights legislation that would be far more effective. The Little Rock Nine. We saw this upper image in the right-hand corner a little while ago. Here you have that same girl, just a different angle. And the Little Rock Nine, many southern states, and again, Little Rock Nine, many southern states delayed putting the Brown decision into action. Why? Because there was no federal law, there was no federal enforcement. This is just a court decision. Court decisions do not have the power of law. There needs to be a follow-up by the legislative branch and the executive branch. Legislation needs to be passed, signed, and enforced. Okay. Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus. It's a heck of a name. ordered the Arkansas National Guard, keep in mind Arkansas, part of the Deep South, ordered the Arkansas National Guard to surround Little Rock's Central High to prevent 9 African American students from enrolling. And these two images right here. There you have the National Guard standing in the doorway, preventing them from entering. And here you have black students, there's one there, being taunted and yelled at, cursed, who knows what else, as they're trying to enter school. This is an attempt to desegregate Little Rock schools. Now, President Eisenhower, keep in mind President Eisenhower is in office for the bulk of the 70s, ordered federal troops to Little Rock to ensure the Little Rock 9 could safely enter school. Now, I said a moment ago, and I may be mistaken, this caption right here reads that those are federal troops escorting them. At first, I thought those were the Arkansas National Guard keeping them out, but it probably is the federal troops allowing them to enter and then escorting them away from school. Sad. We have to have federal troops to allow 9 young black students, or 9 students, forget their color, but 9 students to enter school and go to school. That is how divisive the South was. That's how racist the South was at that time. And just because Faubus is a jerk, he closed the school until the courts forced it to be reopened. And then here is a picture of Governor Faubus. So the Little Rock 9, Arkansas's Governor Orville Faubus attempted to stop African Americans from entering a Little Rock high school, which was Central High. He called out the National Guard, the Arkansas National Guard, to stop him. President Eisenhower sent federal troops down there to force them to move aside so they could enter. Faubus, the Democrat governor of Arkansas, closed the school until it was forced open by the courts a couple years down the road. Southerners resist integration. Another image we've already looked at. Everybody who's seen Forrest Gump knows this. George Wallace, the Alabama governor, 1963, standing in the doorway of the University of Alabama, preventing blacks from enrolling. Now, if we've seen the movie, we saw one of the black students drop her book. Forrest picks it up and gives it to her. If you haven't seen the movie, great movie. I'm not going to show it to you, but again, you get the idea. So here we have the governor of the state of Alabama defying the federal government. Again, we've talked about this. Southern Democrats in Congress banded together to use their power to stop passage of civil rights legislation. Particularly in the Senate, it's pretty easy. The leader of the Senate Majority Leader, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who eventually becomes president, the senior senator from the state of Texas, led a filibuster to stop passage of legislation in the late 50s. If you're a Southern Democrat, you are at best a segregationist. At worst, you're an outright racist. It is that simple. 1964, Lester Maddox, a white restaurant owner, right there, wielded an axe, had an axe, attacked an African American waiting to enter his whites-only restaurant. Oh, by the way, how's he rewarded? He's later elected governor of Georgia. Georgia is part of the Deep South. The Democrat Party-controlled South at this time.